In the deep dark of space, Captain Darren Holt finally allowed himself to relax after weeks of nonstop duty aboard the human battle cruiser Horizon Lance. The ship drifted on its regular patrol, far from home but wrapped in a calm silence that felt rare and precious. For days the crew had been tense, watching empty star fields and listening to the quiet hum of engines, waiting for any sign of danger. But no alarms had sounded, no distress calls had appeared, and no strange signals had haunted their screens. It felt, at least for a moment, like the galaxy had paused its endless trouble just to give them one night of peace. Darren removed his uniform jacket and let himself fall into his bunk, listening to the steady pulse of the ship that he had come to trust like a second heartbeat. The lights dimmed automatically, soft and warm, and he felt sleep pulling at him. The last thing he thought about was how good it felt to breathe without fear. But that moment ended in a single violent heartbeat. Without warning, the ship shook like a giant fist had punched its side. Darren snapped awake as red emergency lights exploded across his cabin and sirens screamed through every hallway. He threw himself out of bed as another impact slammed into the hull, this one stronger, sharp enough to send objects flying from shelves. The calm night turned into pure chaos in a second. Over the comms came broken, panicked voices shouting, coughing, alarms mixing with static. Darren grabbed his uniform, pulling it on as he ran into the corridor. The air smelled of burning wires and the deck vibrated under his feet. The whole ship seemed to groan in pain. Smoke drifted through the hull from an electrical fire somewhere deeper inside. "Who's attacking us?" Darren yelled, but no one answered. He sprinted toward the bridge, passing crew members who were doing the same, some half-dressed, some bleeding, all terrified. A third impact struck, heavier than the first two, and the lights flickered, dimmed, then struggled back to life. When Darren reached the bridge, the scene was worse than he expected. Consoles sparked, several screens were dark, and crew members were fighting to keep the systems alive. Over the forward window, blazing red beams of enemy fire cut across the void, lighting up the stars with deadly streaks. And then Darren heard it, the unmistakable scratching sound like metal claws dragging across the hull. It was a sound every human feared, a sound burned into military history. Only one enemy made that noise: the Krith Dominion, humanity's oldest and most merciless enemy. The creatures who hunted planets like prey. The ones who never attacked without the intention to wipe out entire populations. The ones humanity hoped they would never see again. Darren felt his chest tighten, not from fear for himself, but fear for his crew and the people back home. He had gone to sleep believing the galaxy was quiet. He had closed his eyes in peace. But now, standing on the burning bridge of the Horizon Lance, watching Krith ships swarm like a pack of predators closing in for the kill, he understood that peace had been an illusion. The night had not been calm, it had been the quiet before the storm. And when he woke up, the storm was already here. The bridge of the battlecruiser Horizon Lance was alive with chaos when Captain Darren Holt reached it, and for a moment he had to force himself to stay steady as the ship shook under a fresh wave of enemy fire. Officers shouted over one another, sparks flew from broken panels, and warning lights glowed like angry red eyes across every surface. Lieutenant Mira Solon stood at the tactical console, her face pale in the flickering light, but her voice strong as she reported that stealth cruisers from the Krith Dominion had struck without warning, slipping through human defenses as if they knew exactly where to strike. Outside the forward window, the scene was even worse. Krith ships moved through space with terrifying grace, their dark hulls glowing with red energy as they fired beam after beam into the scattered human fleet. Smaller human vessels burst apart in bright flashes. Others drifted dead, their engines broken, their crews silent. The enemy formation was tight and cruel, surrounding the Horizon Lance like a pack of predators circling their wounded prey. Mira shouted that communications were breaking apart and the fleet commander had gone silent, either destroyed or unable to respond. Darren could feel the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders like heavy armor. He saw the fear on the faces around him, but beneath that fear he also saw something else: trust. They were waiting for him to speak. They needed direction, or they would drown in panic. Another beam struck the hull, shaking the entire ship and pulling several officers off their feet. Darren grabbed the rail beside the captain's chair and shouted for the helm officer to bring the ship around. They could not outrun the Krith. Their engines were already damaged, and they could not hide. The Krith had already marked them. But Darren knew something about human nature. When cornered, humans fought with a fire brighter than any star. He pointed at the largest enemy vessel on the screen, a giant crimson-lit cruiser at the center of the enemy formation, and ordered the helm to head straight for it. The bridge fell silent for a heartbeat as the crew processed his command. Mira turned to him, eyes wide, and shouted over the rumbling hull that charging the enemy command ship was suicide. Darren met her gaze and said it was strategy. If they struck the enemy's center, they might break the control link that kept the Krith fleet in perfect formation. Without that link, the enemy could lose coordination long enough for surviving human ships to regroup. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had left. Slowly, the crew nodded, one by one, accepting his decision. The Horizon Lance shuddered as the engines pushed it forward, forcing the ship into a straight run toward the massive hostile cruiser. Enemy beams lit up the darkness like rivers of red lightning, streaking past the human ship as it maneuvered between explosions and debris. Darren stood at the front of the bridge, gripping the rail, feeling the ship respond to every order like a living creature fighting to survive. In that moment, he understood the truth. Humans had never won because they were stronger. They won because they refused to fall. So they charged into the fire together, a lone human warship cutting through a sea of enemies, carrying with it all the hope humanity had left. As the battle cruiser moved closer to the towering alien flagship, the enemy responded with new fury, and the hull of the Horizon Lance rattled under a rain of fire that burned across its armor like falling stars. Captain Darren Holt felt every impact through the floor, but he stood firm at the center of the bridge, refusing to show fear even as warning symbols flashed all around him. A loud alarm began to scream, sharper than all the others, and Lieutenant Mira Solon shouted that enemy boarding pods from the Krith Dominion were heading straight for them. No one had wanted to hear those words. The Krith were not only killers, they were invaders who tore into ships like beasts tearing into prey. Moments later, the pods slammed into the hull with brutal force, shaking the ship so hard that panels fell from the ceiling. The sound that followed was worse. The screech of alien claws tearing through metal, the unmistakable cry of creatures who lived for war. Darren gave the order for Marine squads to form lines in the entry corridors, and the ship filled with the heavy footsteps of armored humans racing to defend their home. The first breach opened in a storm of sparks, and towering Krith warriors burst through the hole, their armor shining like wet black stone, moving with a speed that made their huge size even more terrifying. Their armor seemed alive, crawling across their skin in shifting patterns, glowing faintly with red energy. Human rifles fired in a violent storm of light, but the Krith pushed forward with blades, spikes, and claws, each step shaking the ground under their weight. Darren grabbed his rifle and joined the defenders, firing shot after shot as alien bodies pushed toward them. Marines struggled to hold the line, and the corridors became a nightmare of close combat, full of smoke, gunfire, and screams. One Marine was thrown aside like a broken doll, another cut down by a blade that glowed with heat. Darren barely ducked under a massive alien strike. rolling across the floor and firing into the creature's chest until it collapsed. He rose only to see another Krith towering over Mira, ready to crush her, but she dodged beneath its arms and plunged her shock blade deep into the weak joint at its neck, bringing it crashing to the floor. She turned to Darren, breathless, saying the enemy was pushing too fast, that they were losing ground in 3 corridors at once. Darren looked around and saw the truth in her words. Humans were brave, but they were being overwhelmed by the sheer force and size of the invaders. For every Krith they killed, 2 more seemed to appear. Fires spread through the hallways, the air filled with the smell of burning metal and alien blood. Darren's mind raced. Staying on their ship meant slow defeat. Fighting on these narrow corridors gave the Krith the advantage. The only way to turn the battle was to do something bold, something no Krith would expect. Through the smoke and chaos, Darren shouted that they needed to take the fight to the enemy instead of waiting for death to reach them. They had to board the alien flagship itself. Mira stared at him, shocked, but she saw the fierce determination in his eyes. The human spirit had not broken. As more Krith warriors roared and charged, Darren gathered the surviving Marines, shouting above the noise that they had one chance. A crazy, impossible chance, but it was better than waiting to die. And so, with the Horizon Lance locked in a deadly embrace with the alien vessel, Darren made the decision that would change the course of the battle. They would leave their burning ship and storm the enemy's heart. The 2 ships collided with such force that everyone inside felt the shock travel through their bones, and the metal-on-metal scream that followed was like the cry of some wounded giant drifting across space. The human ship and the alien flagship locked together in a twisted embrace, HULL plates bending and grinding until the ships were connected like 2 broken halves forced into one shape. Smoke filled the air, lights flickered, and for a moment it was hard to tell which part of the ship belonged to humans and which belonged to aliens. But Captain Darren did not hesitate. He led his small group of tired, bruised Marines through the ruined passageways, pushing toward the breach where the 2 ships had fused. They stepped through a torn hole that opened into the alien vessel, and immediately the air felt different, heavier, charged with a strange energy that made their skin crawl. The walls inside were made of dark metal mixed with something that looked like bone, and glowing symbols pulsed like beating hearts along the corridors. Every sound echoed in eerie waves, and the dim red lights made it feel as if the ship itself was alive and watching them. Mira, breathing hard but steady, pointed to the direction of the core chamber based on the readings from her portable scanner, saying that if they destroyed the heart of the alien flagship, the entire enemy fleet would lose its coordination. The Marines nodded, knowing the plan was a desperate one, but it was the only chance they had left. As the group advanced through the strange halls, the floor shook under their feet, warning them that the ship's defenders were approaching, and they came first as shadows, then as towering shapes sharp with armor spikes. A massive alien warlord stepped into view, its armor covered in glowing patterns that shifted like living fire, its tall frame filling the entire corridor. Its voice was deep and rough, echoing down the hall as it mocked the humans for thinking they could invade its ship. Darren raised his weapon, but the warlord swung a hammer-like weapon that smashed into the wall, sending shards of metal flying past the Marines and making several of them stumble back. Then everything exploded into a violent fight. Marines fired at the creature, but it advanced through the storm of bullets with terrifying speed, swatting men aside as if they were nothing but insects in its path. Darren dodged a blow that cracked the floor where he had just stood, and he rolled behind a pillar while Myra and the others tried to draw the creature's attention. Gunfire filled the corridor, sparks danced through the air, and the smell of burning metal mixed with the thick, heavy scent of alien blood. The warlord roared and charged again, and the entire hallway trembled. Darren shouted for everyone to fall back toward the core chamber, hoping to trap the beast where the ship's machinery would limit its movements. The team ran, stumbling and sliding through smoke-filled passageways as the huge alien chased them, smashing through walls in its fury. Finally, they reached the glowing chamber where the core pulsed like a giant red heart. The warlord burst in behind them, tearing through the doorway as Darren stood his ground. The Marines formed a rough line around him, not willing to fall back any farther. They were outnumbered, wounded, exhausted, but they refused to break. Darren stepped forward, lifting his rifle with shaking hands, and met the warlord's burning eyes. He knew this was the moment everything depended on. There was no turning back now, no escape, no second chance. Either they would destroy the enemy's heart, or the enemy would destroy theirs. The core chamber glowed with a deep, steady red light that washed across the walls like the pulse of a living creature. And as Darren stumbled inside with the last of the Marines, he felt the heat of the energy rising through the floor beneath his boots, as if the ship's heart was waiting for him. The massive alien warlord followed with a roar that shook the room, its armor cracked in places but still burning with violent strength, and it moved straight toward Darren with a fury that promised death. Before Darren could react, the creature's giant hand closed around his throat and lifted him high into the air, its grip so strong he could barely breathe. His vision dimmed and he felt the cold touch of fear for the first time that day. The warlord's eyes glowed like molten metal as it growled that humans were small things pretending to be warriors, nothing more than fragile bones wrapped in thin skin. Darren tried to pull free, kicking and clawing at the monster's arm, but the alien only squeezed harder. His lungs screamed for air, the world spinning around him. Then, at the edge of his fading vision, he saw Myra charging toward the warlord with her blade raised. She didn't hesitate, didn't slow down, didn't think about the size of the enemy. She leapt at its back and drove her blade deep into the exposed joints of its armor, where the plates moved the most. The warlord roared in pain and let Darren fall, turning with rage to throw Myra across the room. She hit the floor hard, sliding until she stopped against a pillar. But her attack had done enough. It had exposed a weakness, and Darren saw it clearly. Struggling for breath, coughing and shaking, he forced himself to his knees and pushed himself to his feet. The warlord stormed toward Myra to finish her, but Darren grabbed its arm, shouting to pull its attention back. The creature swung at him, and he barely dodged the massive blow that cracked the metal where his head had been a moment before. Every muscle in his body hurt, but he kept moving, dodging and firing at the weakened parts of its armor. Each shot slowed the alien a little more, and Darren knew he had only one chance left. His hand went to the explosive charge clipped to his belt, a compact device made for last resort situations, powerful enough to destroy a whole chamber if placed correctly. He glanced at the giant pulsing core in the center of the room and understood that this was the moment everything had been leading to. While the warlord staggered from another well-placed shot, Darren ran toward the core, climbing over pipes and pushing past the unbearable heat until he reached a cracked section of the energy shell. With shaking fingers, he armed the charge and slammed it deep inside the opening. The warlord realized what he was doing and roared, rushing toward him with desperate speed, but it was already too late. Darren threw himself back, shouting a warning to everyone in the chamber. The explosion erupted with a blinding flash that swallowed the room, ripping through the alien ship's heart like a storm of white fire. The shockwave tore through the walls, through the floors, through every hull of the vessel, breaking the connection that held the enemy fleet together. Outside, entire formations of alien ships faltered, their movements turning wild and confused without the power of their flagship guiding them. The alien vessel tore apart from the inside, a dying star exploding in slow motion. Darren felt the blast lift him off his feet, felt the heat burn across his skin, felt the world shake around him, yet as everything turned to light and fire, He knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had given humanity a fighting chance. The world around Darren was nothing but fire and noise as the alien flagship tore itself apart from the inside. Yet through the ringing in his ears and the blinding light, he felt the slow return of gravity and the cold bite of metal beneath his body. He opened his eyes with effort and found himself lying among broken pipes and shattered walls, wrapped in smoke that tasted like burning metal and dust. For a moment he could not move, unsure if he was alive or drifting in some strange dream, until a hand gripped his arm and pulled him up. Mira's face appeared through the haze, blood running down her cheek but her eyes sharp and bright. She shouted his name, shaking him until he focused. Behind her, a few surviving Marines were dragging themselves out of the wreckage, coughing and stumbling, but alive. The room around them was collapsing, sparks falling like burning snow as the alien ship died. Darren pushed himself onto his feet, forcing his body to move even though every bone seemed ready to break. He saw in the distance a faint glow of human lights where their ship still clung to the alien vessel, its hull torn and burning but stubbornly holding on. There was no time to think. The floor shook again, tilting beneath them as the alien flagship broke apart in huge groaning slabs. Mira pointed toward a narrow path where two bulkheads had slammed together, forming an unstable bridge that connected back toward the breach between the ships. It was the only way out. Darren shouted for everyone to move, helping a wounded Marine stand as they ran across the shaking metal. Piece by piece the ship fell behind them, huge sections crashing down like cliffs collapsing into the sea. Flames erupted along the walls, and the air grew hotter with every step. The path was narrow, twisting, and dangerous, but they pushed through, climbing over fallen beams and jumping across cracks where the floor had split open to reveal burning energy below. At one point the bridge of crushed metal groaned and sagged, and Darren felt it drop beneath his feet. Mira grabbed his wrist and pulled him forward, her strength the only thing keeping him from falling into the glowing depths. They reached the torn edge of their own ship just as another explosion ripped apart the hallway behind them, sending a shockwave that knocked them forward into the arms of waiting crew members. Human hands pulled them inside, sealing the emergency door as fire swallowed the last view of the alien vessel. The sound of the doors locking echoed like a final heartbeat. Inside, the survivors collapsed on the floor, gasping for air as medics rushed toward them. Darren sat with his back against the wall, chest heaving, covered in soot and blood that was not all his own. Outside the window, the alien flagship twisted, bent, and finally exploded into a silent bloom of red and white, scattering across the stars like ashes in the wind. The remaining alien ships drifted in confusion, their formation broken, their control lost. Moments later, surviving human ships regrouped, moving together with renewed strength, and struck the enemy with everything they had left. Lasers flashed across the darkness, and one by one the disoriented alien vessels were destroyed or forced to flee. When the last enemy signal vanished from the screens, cheers filled the human ship. Some laughed, some cried, some simply sat in silence, overwhelmed by the weight of survival. Darren looked at Mira, who sat beside him with her head against the wall, her eyes closed but a faint smile on her lips. They had done the impossible. They had taken the fight into the mouth of the enemy and torn its heart apart. Even if many had fallen, even if the cost was heavy, humanity had stood firm. Darren let his eyes drift to the stars beyond the cracked window, feeling a deep and quiet pride. Humanity had survived not because it was strong, but because it refused to surrender. And as long as that spirit lived, the darkness would never win.